Once upon a time, there was a great city called Shurupak that was built along the shores of the Euphrates River. And the city grew until it was filled with people. And the city became so noisy that the gods themselves began to complain about the din. And so the storm god Enlil became upset because all the noise was disturbing his beauty sleep. And Enlil gathered all the gods and demanded that something be done about this problem, this noise. And he persuaded the gods to wipe out all the mortals in a great flood. But the god Ea gave a warning in a dream to a man named Utnapishtim. The children and the hired men of Utnapishtim worked together to build an enormous boat of 7 decks that was filled with supplies. And the boat was launched and loaded with gold, and Utnapishtim's children and wife and relatives and animals and craftsmen. Early the next day, a great black cloud formed on the horizon, and soon a great storm came down upon them, a storm so powerful that even the gods cowered in fear. The storm raged for 6 days and 6 nights until finally, on the 7th day, the rain stopped and the sea was calm. Utnapishtim opened the hatch of his boat, and he saw that he was surrounded on every side by a great and endless sea. But there, in the distance, he saw a mountain rising from the water. And Utnapishtim sailed towards that mountain for 6 days and 6 nights, and on the dawn of the 7th day, he released a dove into the air. But the dove returned, for there was no place for it to land. And then Utnapishtim released a swallow, but the swallow returned as well. Then Utnapishtim released a raven, and the raven did not come back. And Utnapishtim opened the hatches and came out of his boat, and he made an offering of cane and cedar and myrtle upon the mountaintop in a heated cauldron. And the gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. When you are living in a strange land, one of the best ways to get to know the people that you are living among is to listen to their stories. Those stories will tell you a lot about those people and how they see the world and their place in it. And so when the ancient people of Judah were taken away against their will and forced to live in the land of Babylon and do the work of the Babylonian people, they heard many stories told by their captors. And these stories taught them a great deal about these powerful and warlike people, the Babylonians. And the story of Utnapishtim and the flood was one of those stories. And we know that they heard that story in the streets of Babylon because that story had been around for centuries before they ever got there. The story is found written in the Epic of Gilgamesh, so a story so ancient, a book so ancient, that copies of it have been found that date back to 1800 BC, older than any of the writings of the Bible. And what did the story of Utnapishtim teach the Judahites about their Babylonian captors? It taught them, certainly, about the kinds of gods that the Babylonians believed in. Impetuous gods. Gods who became upset at things like the noise of a city. There were also gods whose default reaction when things weren't going their way was to lash out in violence and destruction. These gods also didn't really think through these reactions of theirs. They clearly regretted it when they destroyed all the humans and no longer received sacrifices from them. They realized just how dependent they were on these filthy, noisy mortals for everything, and came swarming around Utnapishtim's act of worship, as if they were starving. And the expatriate Jews heard these stories of the Babylonian gods, and when they heard them, they looked knowingly at each other, for these things corresponded to everything they knew about their captors. The Babylonians were cruel, ready to lash out in violence against anyone who annoyed them or disturbed them. The Babylonians resorted to violence quickly, and yet often didn't think through the consequences of their actions. As the Hebrews served the Babylonians, together with many other captives, they also knew how dependent the Babylonians were on them. If ever the Babylonians carried through on their frequent threats to wipe out what they called these noisy vermin, these humans, the ones who served them, the Babylonians would have been starving, scrambling for resources. They were just like their gods. Now, the Jews had their own stories of a great flood, stories that no doubt were somewhat based on shared ancestral memories of some great cataclysmic event. In their stories, the hero was called Noah, not Utnapishtim. But apart from that, the stories were so alike that when they heard the Babylonian epic, many aspects must have sounded very familiar. For example, the story of Noah ended much the same, with Noah sending out birds to look for land and a final sacrifice when he finally came to disembark from the ark. Now, of course, the Hebrews didn't worship a bunch of gods like the Babylonians. They believed that there was only one God who was worth worshiping. And so in the story of Noah, it featured only one God who made the decision to wipe out all humans, but apparently also chose to warn and save the hero. It's a little bit more difficult to tell the story, you see, when you have to explain everything according to the will of one and the same God, but the Hebrews managed to make sense of the story. In my opinion, the Hebrew story was much better in some ways than the Babylonian version. The Babylonian god's decision to flood the earth was based basically on a noise complaint that was just taken too far. The God of Israel had a better reason for the flood. He saw how humanity had fallen into the habit of responding to evil and violence with ever more evil and violence. The flood in this Hebrew story was a desperate attempt to break that never-ending cycle of ever-increasing violence. That does seem like a fairly good reason to do something, even if the strategy is, well, a little bit questionable. The fact of the matter is, you can never solve the problem of violence and slaughter with more violence and slaughter. It doesn't work. The Hebrew story also ended with a scene very reminiscent of the Babylonian tale, with Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, smelling the pleasing odor of Noah's sacrifice and regretting the decision to destroy everything in a flood. Perhaps there was here a dim echo of the ancient Babylonian tale. But it also ended with a new promise that God made to the survivors. A promise focused very much on the spiraling problem of violence that had led to the flood in the first place. I will never again curse the ground because of humans, God says. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. So you see, human nature doesn't really change, but God has learned that responding to slaughter with more slaughter doesn't really solve anything. Isn't it time we learned that as well? The story of the flood that was told by the people of Judah was, however, also influenced by its encounter with the Babylonian tale. And one of the Hebrews, one of those who had encountered the Babylonian tale, we don't know what his name was, but he was probably a member of the priestly class. But whoever he was, he had an extraordinary experience as a result of encountering the Babylonians and hearing their stories. He was inspired by God. Now, we don't really know how that might have happened. Could have been a dream, could have come in a vision, or it might have come in the form of a very deep conviction that the Babylonian way of relating to the world was wrong, and that God wanted the people of Judah to see things in a different way. But somehow this priest came to see that God had laid it on him to add to the story of Noah. And so the priestly author came up with a very important insight into how the experience of the flood had changed God, had changed God's approach. And it was an insight that was brilliant and clearly inspired. He added to the story of Noah a detail. He made it clear that God didn't just like the smell of the sacrifice, that God did something about his regret for the flood. God decided to make a covenant. As for me, God says to Noah, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, what did this newly inspired ending added to the story do? Well, it made it clear to the Jews who had experienced the devastation of living in exile in Babylon. It made clear to them in unmistakable terms that the God that the people of Israel served was not like the gods of Babylon. Their God was not just in it for the smoke of the sacrifices. God was not just tolerating them, so long as they weren't too noisy, for the payoff of receiving their worship. No, their God was a God who cared, who was in relationship with humanity and with every living creature on the face of the earth. Because, of course, you only make covenants with people that you are in relationship with. And this was a remarkable contrast to the gods who are featured in the story of Utnapishtim. And think about what that means for a moment. These people who had experienced living as exiles in Babylon had heard the Babylonian tale. They had seen how the Babylonians lived out their relationship to their gods. And that experience left them with a new, deeper, better understanding of who their God was. That their God was a God who made covenants with them, with the whole world, and everything that lived upon it. See, that's the fascinating thing about the story of Noah in Genesis. There are clear layers of development in this story. There are various stories, basically, that have been put together. For example, there is one version of the story in which Noah takes 2 of every kind of animal into the ark. And there's another story in which Noah makes a point of taking 7 of every kind of clean animals into the ark. So what happened, those were 2 stories that somebody intentionally edited together. And we can actually still trace the seams between the stories. So pretty clearly, this was a story that developed over time. And I don't have any problem observing that. I don't see any contradiction between observing that and believing that the Bible is an inspired book. After all, if God is that powerful, why wouldn't God decide to inspire a series of authors reacting to different events over a long period of time to develop the various layers in the story? Because there's meaning in those layers. And so we come to see the Bible developing over time as a living document for people who are coming to discover who their God is through a variety of experiences, including their contact with the people of the Babylonians. That's kind of amazing, isn't it? And honestly, I think such a thing is far more helpful to us as we continue to seek to work out our relationship with God than a story that was just written once and remained fixed ever since. You know, today, we are being told a new version of the story of the flood. It is a story of coming disasters. You've all heard it. And no, it's not really a story of God's, but it is a story of consequences. Consequences for the excesses of human beings. And you want to know what the problem with the humans is according to this new story? It's not that our cities are too noisy or that human beings are too prone to violence, though honestly we haven't come very far in terms of solving either of those problems. But no, the problem is that we are burning too much carbon, have been burning it for too long, mostly, of course, in an endless pursuit for never-ending wealth. And what is the consequence of this? Well, according to the modern story, the consequence, among other things, is that the glaciers are going to melt, are melting, that the floodwaters will rise with devastating effect. And this is one of the key, very frightening stories of our modern age. And we hear this story all the time. And the question is, what do we as people of faith, as people who take the Bible seriously, what do we do with that story? Do we take the story of Noah and his flood as we have always understood it and just leave it unaffected, unadapted to this new threat, this new story? I mean, yeah, honestly, I do hear Christians doing exactly that. They say, oh, well, God promised at the end of Noah's flood that he would never destroy the world again with water, so obviously what the scientists are predicting, it'll never happen. The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. There are Christians who react that way. But I am not convinced that that's what our response should be. You know, a priestly writer heard a story, new to him, told by the Babylonians in his day. And it led him to be inspired by God to tell the old Hebrew story in a new way. I think that might be what we are being called on to do today. We need a new story, or a new version of the story that is challenging us to rethink our relationship with God and with the world that God created and all the things that live upon it. How can we tell this story? How should we tell this story in new ways? I'm actually not going to tell you that. I think we need to live with this story in these new challenging ways for a while. Open ourselves up to the new information, the new truth. And if we do that, I believe that God will inspire us with new insights, new understandings of the commitment of God to us and to the world. See, that's the really fun thing about having a living book of stories like this, one that helps to guide us into an ever deeper relationship with our God. Lord our God, we are living in challenging times. We are dealing with some pretty scary stories that are forcing us to look at the world in new ways. Inspire us, guide us to deeper understandings of our world, our place within it, in relationship to you. Amen.